thank you to all the speakers for coming back, hanging with us, and thank you for all the people in attendance as well. So since this is all about misconceptions or hindsights of 2020-ish in 2021, I want to throw this out to the panel. Whoever wants to respond first. What is one misconception either that was not covered or that was covered by a different panelist in the general topic? So like, for instance, Vanessa covered Southern campaigns. What's one misconception that she missed, picking on my fellow park ranger there?
I missed none. I'm just going to say that.
I'll talk about one huge misconception is the fact that the war ended after Yorktown. I mean, there's so many people that think that, and especially when you go down to South Carolina and Georgia, it was not ended. I mean, it was the same thing in the North, but it was really a hotbed in a relatively small confined area in South Carolina, and then there was Wayne in Georgia, before Savannah. So that's a big thing right there, and I find those South Carolina and Georgia operations really interesting. Probably because I know enough about them to be interested in them, and not enough about them to not have anything to learn. I want to get down there and go over the terrain.
I know I'm the moderator. I probably shouldn't jump in here, but I'm excited as well because there was some recent archaeological findings from the Combigby River about where John Laurens was killed there late in the war. So unfortunately, I think it's still on private property, but eventually it'd be cool to see that location as well. So one of those tragic last deaths of the American Revolution. Well,
that's another reason why I like that one pension deposition that he mentions, being discharged just before, or it was either just before or right after Laurens was killed. So yeah, it's a shout out to John Laurens, even though I can't hear it.
And I would say another, misconception. I think Travis talked a little bit about it, but just like not how define the lines of, patriot and loyalists, and how those, I think I talked a little bit about it with John Honeyman as far as like trying to tease out which side people were on. But, I think there's a good percentage of people throughout the war that were either trying to play both sides or, looking out for themselves or their families, which I think anybody can, admit is would be, it's easy to hold up those who put country or service ahead of their own individual, beliefs. But I think there was a large percentage of people that are trying to get by, and survive this war any way they could. And it's not always the most heroic or the most ennobling stories, but I think it's the truth for many people that they were trying to, just get by. And if that was siding with the Patriots, it's that. If it's siding with the Loyalists, it's that. And if it's siding with both at different times, they're doing that as well. And it's something that, we kind of tend to think of it, the blue-coated Americans versus the red-coated British, and it wasn't that simple throughout the whole war, for sure.
Yeah, actually, Todd Braced has done some nice work on the number of men who changed sides. Captured by the British or the Loyalists, and then basically, so they didn't have to stay in prison. They changed sides. Some of them actually deserted back to the Americans, and some of them stayed in those units and went over to the West Indies. And some of those guys applied for pensions after the war from the federal government and got them. So it's, it was definitely not a cut and dried black and white war. It was really complicated.
On that same point, some of the research I'm doing for the Charleston during the Revolution, they had, and this is the case in New York too, where they had these prison ships where they were putting a lot of the American prisoners in. And the British, in Charleston were actively trying to recruit from these prisoner populations. You had to go fight in the West Indies, and and it must have seemed like a way out for a lot of guys to get off of what would have been the most horrible conditions of the British prison ships. And that's where, when you talk about things that are ennobling or putting your country ahead, I mean, the fact that so many guys refuse to do that, is amazing to me, that somebody would have an out of getting out of, starving to death or dying of malnutrition or disease on a prison ship, but refuse to do that, and instead, stick it out, and sometimes, pay with their life. What motivates somebody to take that stand is pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah, I actually just read a nice article by Larry Babbitts on the deserters serving, or not deserters, but the guys who had turned coat and they decided to join the British Legion, and whether they had an effect on cowpens. So that's there's still so much to be written about this period, which makes it a great, I think still an open period for a lot of historians. And that's why I think it's so fun.
I definitely second that, John. I think there's a whole lot to study, a whole lot to write, a whole lot. Phill, I appreciated you mentioning about some archaeological stuff that's been found, because that's continual and ongoing, and we can always learn more. And I think that's something that's going to be fun to explore as more and more people start paying attention relating to the 250th coming up, or happening. I think you're going to have people wanting to know this and more information. So we've got our work cut out for us.
I actually want to follow up on something you said, Vanessa, about I actually teach, and I don't take any offense to what you said earlier. So don't feel
Okay, good.
I want to follow up on that. Why there's so much conceptions? Because actually, being in the teaching world at the high school level, they're not being taught revolution. At least I can only speak for Pennsylvania. I don't know if that's true countrywide, but they're not taught early American history in high school. They don't get it. We start in 1920 in high school. And so why is that a problem? Because in theory, they should be getting it in middle school, but they're not. Because basically, until they get to high school, nobody is forced to actually learn anything. So we have kids coming into high school that don't have basic skills, let alone the base knowledge they should be coming in with, because they're socially promoted till they get to 9th grade. So even though they're technically being taught early American history in, I think it's 8th grade in Pennsylvania, they're not actually learning it or remembering any of it. And then they come to high school, they're not taught it. So you're getting to your point where we're producing high school graduates that don't know the America's founding. Well, there's the reason.
Well, in South Carolina, it's 4th grade when they learn about basically a lot of it's almost it. And I think you're right that we're trying to teach them some of the stuff slightly at a younger age, but really it should be in high school when we start to dive into some of the universal meanings behind the American Revolution. I mean, if you boil it down to its most simplest terms, most 4th graders, most 6th graders, they're going to get some of it. But once you hit high school and you start to have more of that, life experience, or you start to have a better understanding of the world around you, just because at that age and the way your brain has started to develop, that's the time to really instill some of these life lessons that you can learn from our American history. And so it's unfortunate that we don't have that kind of more in-depth curriculum. I get that they're learning about a lot of world history, at least from my experience with studying any sort of high school curriculum. And thank you, Mike, for being a wonderful teacher, despite your limited resources. But yeah, I get that they're trying to understand things at the global level, but we miss a lot of opportunity for them to really take to heart some of what we can learn from the American Revolution. And you're right, we're having adults. I mean, the best math class I ever took was in college, and it was the quote unquote dumb math class, because I hate math, even though I took like calculus in high school. I don't know how I passed. Was when I basically learned how to balance a checkbook, because I took the dumb math class, and how to apply for a loan. So those are life skills. Well, think of the life skills that we can learn from history that we're not teaching kids before they leave the regular school system. So
And in history's because you were right about the standardized test issue, because we're not a tested subject, we get pushed aside.
mhm.
And then they don't care if those kids pass that class because we're not important.
Yeah,
And and I don't want to just say because I have friends that teach in other districts, it's across the board. It's happening everywhere.
And I would say this is also not a new problem. I remember 20 years ago when I was in high school, growing up here in Northern Virginia, near Alexandria, one of my first exposure to the history of the Revolutionary War and George Washington was going to Mount Vernon, learning about the history at the actual places where the history happened, and waiting in school, excitedly to finally get to the Revolution. And in high school, we actually did learn about the Revolution, and it was all of a half-hour class, and it was more about the causes and then more about the effects. And it was like, oh yeah, and there was a battle at Lexington and Yorktown, but if you want to learn more about that, you can read on your own or whatever. And it was like, I've been waiting all this time to actually be able to talk about this in class, and it was blown over in just a couple sentences. And that's where personally, that's where I think like the places, being able to go to Gadsby's Tavern, being able to go to Brandywine Battlefield, being able to go to the places where the actual history happened is great, because you actually go there and learn from the site and from people who are as knowledgeable about the importance of these places and that history that oftentimes is kind of blown through in school or classrooms. Teachers have all sorts of competing interests and lots of different subject matter and lots of different things. Exactly. Technology.
Well, I'll tell you, I think in light of the time constraints and curriculum constraints and all that stuff, I think the best thing that the history teacher can do, or an English teacher, or whatever teacher, but history teacher is what we're talking about right now, is to ignite an interest in a lot of kids, a couple kids, one kid. That's if you can do that, then and it means they go on and look at stuff on their own. That's phenomenal. I think at its best, history, again, this is the best of all possible worlds. History will not only give you an idea of our history or world history, but like in America will help make you familiar with the founding documents, make you familiar with our government, and also like English class or literature class should teach you empathy, because when you get into the first person documents and you see what people have experienced on a personal level, which is a way to build an understanding of like a larger event. That's where you're going to get empathy from, and that's where you get from literature and all that, and that's a huge thing for understanding history, right there.
So I know I'm supposed to just be the moderator, but I'm going to interject here. Because I had a unique experience. I graduated from a high school on a military base in Northern England. So it was a Department of Defense school. And from there, it was actually interesting because our history and civics classes were a little more in tune with what was exactly happening. So I graduated in the early 2000s. So right after 9/11, I was over on a military school for Bosnia and Herzegovina. So like, our teachers actually try to tune it into what was actually happening with the military and the history as well. So it was kind of interesting to see that there's lines on maps that we talk about how the routes they made it through to Yorktown and so forth, and having someone talk about how they used that in military practice and theories and so forth on the front line. And actually I thought it was so cool, and being in 5th grade when like someone's father came in dressed in his battle dress uniform or something, and they talked about how they're studying the same thing we were doing and so forth. So that's probably why I got caught up in history. So you can blame that Department of Defense schools and everything for my but I do have I want to get to this question because I think it'll be great for the panelists. So it came in from one of our attendees here. It goes, probably most Americans' picture of the Red War at its 250 will be some yet to be produced film or TV series. What would you pitch as the perfect story to tell Americans on film about the Red War at 250, fiction or nonfiction? And he finishes this question with saying, like a Saving Private Ryan of 1781. So you have to pick one. You're going to pitch it to Spielberg. What's it going to be?
Oh, that's easy. The Overmountain Men on the Overmountain Victory Trail as they
Ooh.
gather and march towards the Battle of Kings Mountain, because it's totally, the what I was talking about before in my presentation, that kind of grassroots idea of, you got to protect your home and country, literally, because you get this threat from Ferguson saying, if you don't fall in line, I'm going to basically destroy your farms and kill all your family and, just completely destroy you. And these mountain men, these frontier men, these backcountry men were like, I don't think so. And they march over 300 miles to find Ferguson. And well, we know how that ended.
Before we move on, Vanessa, isn't that pretty much the Patriot right there? That's what they do. Benjamin.
Oh my God, I knew mentioning the Patriot earlier was going to come back to haunt me. It's a work of fiction. Okay, so I have a lot to say about Hollywood and historical films. It all started when I first saw the Santa Fe Trail about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and what a disaster. It is so amazing that Hollywood tries to do, I'm going to get off my soapbox soon, I promise. It's so amazing that Hollywood tries to turn history into this fanatical, like, fantasy world when the actual history is just as crazy and exciting and thrilling and adventurous and sad and thrilling as what Hollywood wants to make it. So they need a proper telling of that story and tell the story of the individuals that participated in that and not fictionalize it.
I do feel like some of the Overmountain Men would have had facial hair like me. Like by the time they marched there, they were, or me or Michael right here. So,
but the thing with facial hair is if they did have it, it wouldn't have been cultivated. It wouldn't have been nicely coiffed and cultivated. Would have been, and then eventually they would have shaved at some point. But I
appreciate John that you think this is cultivated, so I do appreciate that.
With Vanessa though, but I'm biased towards my own campaign. For those of you that don't know, I'm working on a new book to cover the River War with Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin, and I think the story of the siege of Fort Mifflin and what those guys went through would be just as, because I think you got to tell the story from the average soldier, almost like a Band of Brothers, but you create a Rev War version of that, and that the stories of that siege and what those guys went through and that swamp. It wasn't an island, it was a swamp. Joseph Plummartin's accounts and a French officer, I think it's not DeFlore, or do I have that right?
Yeah, no, I think you're DeFlore. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's DeFlore.
His descriptions of the fighting on that island, I think that would make, even if it was just a 1 hour documentary, I think it would make a compelling story.
Well, then you have the explosion of the Augusta, and then you have the Battle of Red Bank. So that's like through the roof.
Yeah, that's what I'm currently working on. I think it's a mile from Fort Mercer, John.
That's cool.
When I ran cross country in high school, and for practice, we used to have to run to Fort Mercer and back to the high school.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm actually going to give a shout out to my northern compatriots, because it's not within the past. It's only within the past 10 years really that I've really learned about the day of Lexington and Concord. It's not just the battles of Lexington and Concord, but it's the day. And how people evacuated their houses. You had women and children and old people and pregnant women, and leaving their houses and going out in the countryside. You have the Concord Minutemen with some other join-ins standing on a hill past Concord Bridge, watching the British march past them, not firing on them. They marched past them to go to another house to look for artillery. And it wasn't until the British came back and halted on the other side of the bridge that the firing finally took place. So there was a question about whether they actually wanted to fire on the British. And then towards the end of the battle, you had these horrible, bloody incidents closer into Boston, where the British were massacring people that they cornered. And if people saw that, they'd be horrified. If they saw the true story of that entire day, not only would it be exhausting, but they'd be horrified. And that's an event that everybody thinks they know everything about, but it's not. But there's so much that's not known about it. And that's just a small microcosm of the entire war. There's just so much. You could bring in experiences of women with the army, women at home trying to keep things together, blacks who joined Lord Dunmore. You know, it's, you know, you could have the story of Colonel Titus in Colonel Ty in New Jersey, who basically commanded an integrated group of whites and blacks loyalists. So yeah, there are so many really cool stories. And we could never trust anybody to do it justice because they would mess it up somehow. But
Someone did say that if you have Ken Burns do it, we're good. So
Yeah.
yeah, there it is. It's in the chat right now. Ken Burns does it.
Well, I like what you say, John, about like having people see something that they don't really. I think that people view the American Revolution as idealized in like a painting like Washington crossing the Delaware, and they don't view it really as messy, bloody, difficult as it actually was. That's actually one of the things I actually do like about The Patriot, is that it focuses more on this military conflict. Because I think, you know, you watch a lot of things and, you know, the focus is on the causes, the ideals, the formation of our government and our country, which is all important. But you know, there was a war that had to happen in order for all that to happen. And being able to show that, I really do like the idea of, yeah, like a Band of Brothers type mini series to try and show this. I think a great unit to follow through would be the 3rd Virginia Regiment, which saw action in New York, Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Germantown, was at Valley Forge, does the march down to Charleston's I mean, it'd probably end like Braveheart, where, you know, these guys all get captured or whatever. But you know,
have you been talking to Jim Taub?
I haven't talked to him about this idea yet, but maybe we can get some Hollywood execs. So.
I think any 250th film, I would love to see, if I'm sure there will be some, but I'd also love to get that dynamic of kind of harking back to Travis's presentation of like that kind of where loyalties lie and how you figure that out. I think there's a lot that can be said. You know, we automatically are like, oh yeah, the British, they were the bad guys and we won, and that's fine. But there's so much more to it than that. And that would be really interesting to explore into a deep dive into like a Band of Brothers type series, because you could really explore that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
no,
I was going to say early on, I got into reading Kenneth Roberts, you know, Rebel in Arms, Rundle, and then I stumbled on this book of Oliver Wiswell about a loyalist. What a great book! I mean, he takes him from Boston all the way down to the Carolinas, and you know, you get a view, you know, for being written in the 30s or 40s, it's still a great book, and he gives you a whole view of the whole loyalist side and brings it down to a human level, and that, you know, that's the kind of stuff that's really amazing.
I'm going to interject here because I think it'd be awesome to do a social network of the 1775, 70, after Lexington Concord, and how they're able to pass this message on from like all the way down to the Carolinas by April 28th. And I mean, everyone remembers playing as a kid the game of telephone in a classroom. And by the time it got around 12 kids, the story is distorted. So it's amazing that the story passed down the Eastern Seaboard and it actually still had a semblance of truth. So I think it'd be cool to have like the Mark Zuckerberg of the 18th century and do the social network, the committees of correspondence. But
then you have the comedy version where it ends up at the end and it's all screwed up.
Yeah, I mean, the poor people in Georgia are going, what's going on? So we have this from Billy coming in. Washington is not known for being a tactical genius. In your opinion, who was the best battlefield commander in the American Army?
Wow.
I got to think about that.
Mark, you're excused since you're a George Washington fanatic. We'll excuse you from.
Yeah, well, I'll go first, and I'll say that Washington, while yeah, tactically he made some mistakes, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, his battlefield composure inspired his men and helped lead to some of the victories that was important. And just also meld it into our last discussion too. There really does need to be a good biopic on Washington. Although I will say, I think David Morse's portrayal of Washington and John Adams is superb, and I think that was the best version. I think Jeff Daniels does an all right job in The Crossing, but nobody beats David Morse. So.
You all portray him too old.
Well, that's what Rob says. He says he's too old. Yes, he looks old, but he gets the composure, the reserve, the dignity. He nails it with that. So
Rob is sitting off camera here right now, just shrugged his shoulders and was like, "I'm not even on the panel, and I'm being, name dropped." So
I'm trying to think, maybe Daniel Morgan.
That's who I was gonna say.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Yes.
Even if
I went to the big leagues.
yeah, even if it's just based on cow pens, it's just with a really tiny force at the end of his tether, and basically his tactics inspired Green's at Guilford Courthouse, where they basically beat the crap out of they lost the battle, but they decimated the British ranks. So yeah, I mean.
That's who I was gonna say. That's who I was gonna say. I mean, you've got this gruff kind of soldier who's leading and inspiring, the soldiers underneath him, but he's also taking advantage of as much information as he's got and using it, and the way he's able to I just really love the fact that he took what was a misconception about militia and used it to his advantage at Cowpens successfully. And it's kind of like, I mean, how can you not like Daniel Morgan? So he was going to be who I would have said.
But to defend Washington before he became a real bureaucrat, with the onset of 77 and especially 78 and on through the rest of the war. I mean, he was a bureaucrat before that, but at the battles of Trenton and Princeton, I think he was let loose. He didn't have as many responsibilities. It was basically do or die. And so his tactical, just in those two battles, his tactical verve right there was probably enough to keep him up top. And like I said, I think after that, his responsibilities just really overwhelmed him, and he was kind of trying to keep an army together and trying to direct all the division commanders, and but I think at Trenton and Princeton he was able to let loose and become basically a small unit commander to a certain extent for pretty much the only time during the war.
I don't disagree with that, because I'm racking my brain trying to run through everybody that I've worked with, like in terms of researching them, and because I focus so much on the 77 campaign, he's got a bunch of lackluster people under him, man.
Well,
Yeah.
I think the answer Billy was looking for is what Brian threw up in the chat, and that's Benedict Arnold being the best battlefield commander in the sense of, and I think that's on the boot monument that's up there at Saratoga, saying that he is the most brilliant of the American commanders. And Brian mentions, he won on land and sea at Valkyr Island, and was known as a particularly enabling general, but I think everybody's view of him has been obviously tarnished by his ultimate treason or whatever. So, but tactically speaking, I mean, I don't know. I think the argument could be made that Arnold is one of the best tactical commanders on the American side. But as Michael, you said, he doesn't have much competition, so.
Yeah.
All right, so here's another question. Now that Billy's not allowed to ask any more questions, and so he's already been disqualified. In the background of most of our screens here are multiple volumes of books. We have a question that came in that said, what is your pre-2000 or non-modern favorite book on the American Revolution?
Ooh.
And it can't be the Emerging Rev War series or ones that have been published by Savas Beatty or other publishers like They Were Good Soldiers. So
no, mine is Charles Royster's A Revolutionary People at War. Admittedly, the Continental Army is my focus. Even though I do branch out a little bit, but that's a magnificent book. It really is, and it'll really open your eyes as far as motivation and brings it down to a personal level. There are others, but that's for me, that stands at the top.
Could it be a journal or diary that somebody had published?
Sure.
Mine
Well,
would be Johann Ewald's diary.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's another one.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
Hessian Jaeger officer.
I'm going
was-
to piggyback off of Mike and say Joseph Plum Martin,
Yeah. that's a good- yeah.
because that's what I was thinking. I don't know how much of his information is 100%, but it really immerses you in the experience, I think.
Actually, I'll give you another one that's not a diary or journal, and I won't even say a specific one. The series of books that Phill Greenwalt Press published for the bicentennial.
Oh yeah, yeah,
That's a great set of books for how old they are.
yeah. There are a few which are like really simplified and they're okay, but there are some Brandywine, Long Island, Saratoga. They're phenomenal, and then some of the other really off the wall books. Yeah, they're still good.
I'm trying to look across the room at my Revwar books, trying to.
I know it's not early 2000 or pre-2000s, but Derek Beck's series on igniting the American Revolution. It's one of, I don't know if you've had the chance to read. It's a 2-volume series, basically on the prelude into the American Revolution, igniting. And I'm trying to bring up the other title because it's missing. The War Before Independence.
Uh-huh,
So, 2-volume series. You almost read like fiction when you read it through, and you're like, realize that you get to the footnotes or the end notes at the end of the book, and you're like, oh, it's done. Those are the type of books.
What's
but
the
yeah,
author? What's the author's name?
Derek Beck.
Beck,
Great guy. Yeah. Igniting and the War Before Independence. Got to bring it up to 1776. Because the questions that's always baffled me is obviously that, oh, well, we just started a war. How did they become patriots and so forth? Spending years at George Washington Birthplace National Monument, where did he become from a British provincial officer to suddenly leading the American Revolution? Like, what was that? Everyone wants that one moment where they switch.
Yeah.
But it's not really that one moment that it switches. But so yeah, so I know I'm struggling as a moderator because I have to interject because I'm a history guy. But Mark, besides Victory or Death, what is the one book?
Pre-2000, I mean, I would say, I mean, one of the best I think is Douglas Southall Freeman's Washington biography, and I think that because of how he takes it as far as from Washington's point of view, what information he's gathering at the time. It's a great campaign study from his point of view. And then the other one I'd say is Devil of a Whipping, about the Battle of Cowpens. Because Babbitts takes it not only the accounts of the people who fought in the battle, but also using archaeology and reenactors and experimental archaeology to judge distance and place and stuff like that, and trying to, on the landscape, being able to interpret that battle. I just think by taking in all these different aspects, it really brings it to life. And so, I would argue those ones.
So without books, we have someone is asking, is anyone currently working on a new biography of Daniel Morgan? Do you think he needs a new biography out there? He's been talked about a little bit, but so no. So I'm sorry, whoever asked that question. Nobody in this panel is currently working on a Daniel Morgan biography.
Sarah wrote something about him not too long ago. It was pretty good.
So I'm gonna.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go on.
I was gonna say I will recommend because Mike was talking about Hazen's Regiment. Holly Mayer, who did a book back in the 90s called Belonging to the Army about camp followers. She just wrote a book on Hazen's Regiment, and I haven't gotten it yet. But knowing Holly and from everything I've heard of it, it sounds like it's really good. So that's a unit study. You are getting more unit studies out of the Revolution, which used to be a Civil War thing. So you're finally getting more and more unit studies.
We're also seeing, so I'm going to add it's a question for Blaine, but I'm going to add to it. He said a future symposium topic could be the race to the Dan River after the Battle of Cowpens. We've seen a lot of Southern literature on this, Southern Gambit, or to the ends of the earth, or to the ends of the world. Why do you think historians are focusing on this race to the Dan?
Probably because Green was a masterful, not a tactician, but an operational commander. I mean, he was amazing for what he did in the South, you know, basically leading Cornwallis on a long run and letting him basically just you know, take his army onto the rocks into Carolinas, even though the army survived. I mean, you know, he ran him one hell of a good race. And he kept his army intact, I mean, which is what Washington did on a larger scale. Plus, subsisting yourself in the Carolinas is not easy, you know, as Cornwallis found out, but also, you know, as the American commanders, as Greene found out, that's a huge, you know, the fact that he was quartermaster for a period during the Valley Forge winter and afterwards. I mean, that was a huge part of what enabled him to do that campaign so successfully, really. So yeah, it's a fascinating campaign, and the fact that it was done with a minimum of bang bang shoot 'em ups. You know, I mean, it was a lot of maneuvering. So yeah, I'd second that.
Yeah, no, I think it's good for any, you know, focus on the Southern campaigns during the Revolution, because I think, you know, until, you know, again, as much as you hate it, the Patriot, I feel like, you know, there really wasn't, there's not much focus on how important these battles were. And, you know, obviously you have the American Civil War that, you know, most of the population has some sort of emotional or intellectual attachment to. And then, but, you know, the Revolution played such an important role that, like, it's often overlooked. So I think that it's great that, you know, as we start nearing the 250th, you know, I hope that there's, more interest and encouragement in researching and learning more about the Southern campaigns in the Revolution, because they are, pretty significant. And yeah, so I think it's great, you know, if it's Greene's March to the Dan, or Guilford Courthouse, or Cowpens, or Charleston, or any of these things, you know, I think it's great. So keep it coming.
All right, so Greene and Morgan, best partnership, strategic and tactical. Is there a better partnership than those two gentlemen in the American Revolution?
Washington and Knox.
Stop it.
There you
No,
go. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
are you kidding me?
From 70, late 75, 76 onwards. Yeah, right.
The only thing that really kills me is after the Revolution, when Washington is president, or even after Washington's presidency during the Quasi-War, Washington puts Hamilton to lead the army in front of Knox. That I think really hurt Knox's feelings, but you know, I think they've always been.
Did you read the Germantown book?
What?
How can you say Knox after what happened in Germantown?
Oh, you know, everybody has a failing now and again, you know.
That was a really bad day.
It's a bad day.
I think it's actually how Knox died. I think someone goes, "What happened at Germantown?" That's when he choked on that chicken bone. Yeah, he had a hiccup there, but
It's unmilitary to leave a castle in your rear. So.
You're gonna get me fired up.
there we go. Do we need a therapy session on Henry Knox at Germantown so Michael can get it out of his system here? So
it's going to have to be electroshock, I think.
It's like telling me that there's somebody else. I did one of these other, I forget what roundtable it was, and somebody was trying to say that Sullivan was to blame for all the Army's problems throughout the war.
poor guy.
Wow.
The French may agree with you, but that's at Newport there. But
Talk about a scapegoat, damn.
yeah. I mean, so all right, let's test your expertise as historians here. We've talked a lot about myths and misconceptions of the war. Most of them have been on the military side of things. Outside of the military sphere, is there a myth or misconception that the general populace has become ingrained with that you would like to reverse? We're going to start right now, and we're going to reverse the trend. So, a myth outside the military of the American Revolution.
I think the most basic one would be that all the colonists supported the war effort. I mean, we kind of hit on that with the Loyalist discussion today, but I think there is a misconception out there from average Americans that everybody was for independence.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's mine.
Mike's claiming it.
I'm claiming
Nice.
that one.
So I'm going to reverse. I'm going to throw this out there that, I mean, as it becomes a more world war with France and Spain, everything going on, we have this misconception that we are the 13 colonies are the most important colonies in the British Empire. But you actually notice that the British, they evacuate Philadelphia, and where do troops go? They go down to the Caribbean or the West Indies.
Mhm.
They go to the Floridas and so forth because they are vastly more important. A few years ago, I'll call it the BC time before COVID. I was able to go to Barbados, and the whole island has tunnels dug under where they could bring infantry and cavalry. A guy could sit on a horse and go into the tunnels of Barbados, go across the island, and come out on the other side, because that's how important the island of Barbados was to the British. And so I think that's a misconception that when the American colonies revolt, it's the biggest issue in the British Empire. And I think we get that because obviously we are all Americans, and so we think we're kind of a big deal, as they say, the kids say today. But throwing it out there.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, Phill, you know, I think we also think that when we did win our independence, that we were then this world player that was out there, you know. And what was the reality was you know, they signed the treaty, and then every European country was kind of like a bunch of vultures standing around these colonies waiting to pick these people off because they didn't think that we would be able to stand as our own country. And I think that's why it's so important when you follow early American history up through past the War of 1812 until we actually, you know, make ourselves a player on the world sphere. I mean, you mentioned Ewald's diary. Ewald and his guys are up in Canada, basically, you know, waiting for this experiment in American liberty to collapse. And then you have these colonies that are going to be up for the pickings. And so, you know, I think we tend to think of ourselves of you know, it's all happened, you know, washing across the Delaware, we won Yorktown, we became a country, we signed the Constitution, and we became a world power. And it really didn't play out that way. And there's all these kinds of, you know, constant, you know, the whole idea of this being an experiment it couldn't be more true. That's a perfect word for it, because, and, you know, all the way up until this very day, you know, we're still experimenting in this whole idea of, you know, some would argue the revolution that really hasn't even stopped. We constantly are redefining ourselves, and, you know, how this whole idea of self-government, you know, was tested during the Civil War, you know, and it's constantly being tested. And so it's kind of interesting to view ourselves not as a world power that was started in 1776, but really something that evolved from, you know, 13 independent states that declared their independence, fought this bloody war, and, you know, continue to make it work over the years.
Well, England had the English Channel and a navy, and we were lucky enough to have the Atlantic Ocean and no navy. Otherwise, we might not have survived.
Someone actually put in the chat a great comment by Blaine, says that whose misconception is that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the most obvious, and it's actually a month later than most. I think we're at August 2nd or August 4th. I think that a lot of the folks come in to sign it, getting some of the dates mixed up. But just, yeah, throwing it out there is one of the major misconceptions.
Well, and I think part of that also, just to kind of piggyback on that, I think part of that is also, you know, that it was this one thing and that was it. Like, okay, Declaration of Independence, and now we're off and running. That it was really this big buildup, and it wasn't just one single thing that we were like, let's all get together and make this decision. I mean, you have 2 continental congresses that happen, and they're having these conversations and trying to figure out if this is the right thing to do. And it's not just one time they all got into a room, signed this declaration, and done.
Yeah.
That it was really complicated, and it ties into some of those thoughts and ideas that we've been talking about with some of the people who are experiencing this history, where it's like, you know, which side do you pick? Do you pick the comfort of British rule, where you're protected. You've got, troops that are going to be able to, or British troops that can help protect you against Native American attacks? Or do you, rebel against the only government you've known? And it's so complicated and so complex, and it builds to, yes, July 4th, independence, whatever, but there's so much more even after that before we can really get to kind of the heart of, okay, here we're doing this.
Well, and you figure the autumn after the declaration was signed, it looked all over. It looked like that was going to be the end right there. I mean, and then later on you had the economy was horrible. I mean, it was, there was rampant inflation, and they were having a hard time feeding the army and keeping it together. And it went in waves during the war. It really did. And again, a lot of people just don't realize that. They really don't realize that at all. What a near run thing it was a number of times.
Yeah.
Our first September 11th, September 1776, John Adams and Ben Franklin are meeting with the Howe brothers to discuss the peace commission.
Mm-hmm.
That's only a few months after they signed the declaration.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a good word is the fragility of the whole thing. I think that, people don't realize how fragile everything was, and that it was all, it could have all gone away at any time. There at numerous points throughout the war. So it's pretty amazing that it did fall into place the way it did.
All right, so since we got a little over 10 minutes left, let me, I'm going to throw a hand grenade into this.
Knox?
'cause,
Henry
Why
Knox?
am I not
Henry
surprised?
Knox, besides Henry Knox. So one of the, of course, obviously, we are dealing with a mass pandemic, inoculations, vaccinations. Washington introduces inoculation or variolation to the Continental Army. So with that being said, besides the smallpox inoculation, what is one thing on the periphery that, actually, let me go back to that. Let me ask, is that a good idea? I mean, what do you view on the view of smallpox, the epidemic, that the belief that smallpox would have been a major player if Washington does not inoculate? Is that a myth? Is that blown out of proportion? Because you hear a lot about this virus being so magnified. So is that just 21st century reading onto it? Later on after the war, you have the yellow fever epidemic. So you hear about these two big viruses. Are they blown out of proportion, or are they pretty accurate on how detrimental they could have been if they didn't do such vast efforts like inoculation?
It would have decimated the army. And I mean, look at what it did to the Northern Army right after the retreat out of Canada. I mean, it even killed I forget his name, but I think it was John Thomas. One of the Massachusetts, John Thomas. He even killed John Thomas. But on the islands up in St. Lawrence, I think it was Sorel. Basically, there was a smallpox camp in the middle of the island, and it was just full of bodies and diseased people. I mean, the fact that he began in spring of 77, maybe early winter 77, with the smallpox camps, I think that made a huge difference. I mean, just after Yorktown, I mean, we had this huge victory at Yorktown, and then I think it's John Howe's diary and a lot of other accounts. The army was being decimated by smallpox, but also I think by other diseases. I think it was typhus and other things. As they headed north from Yorktown to head back to the northern states, they were being dropped off at different parts. And I mean, the Philadelphia hospitals and barracks were full of these guys. And I think it really would have been a real mess. And if you've ever read about the effect that smallpox have on people, which I just did it for an article not too long ago, it's freaking horrific. It's a horrific disease. I mean, if it doesn't, at the very least, it's probably going to leave you disfigured, with pox scars all over your face. And it's liable to, I forget what the percentage of deaths from smallpox was, but it was relatively high. But it was a horrible death too. It's just a horrible. It reminds me of Ebola. that's the kind of death it was. So yeah, I think it was a huge thing that he you know, he got the smallpox vaccine or inoculation into the Army at least.
I throw a disclaimer. I just finished the book's Pox, so I was like on my head here, and I just literally finished it yesterday, and I was just like, wow, like how it, I mean, literally went through, like you said, the Canadian Army, and the militia and so forth. It's killed what 3 out of every soldier killed on the battlefield, with 2 or 3 would die of smallpox and so forth. So I just didn't know what you guys thought about it. So I thought I'd bring it up because obviously you can't escape current news today about a different virus that is wrapping our world. So
Well,
might as well connect it.
And the fact that we've eradicated, knock wood, we've eradicated smallpox at this point, which is, you know, another unbelievably huge thing. I mean, you know, I think it's one of the few diseases we've actually been able to eradicate. So.
And also just to talk about misconceptions, you know, I think that just how deadly all this stuff was, you know, first of all, how deadly the whole war was in the sense that, you know, about 25,000 Americans die, about 25,000 Crown forces die. I mean, you're talking 50,000 people deaths. And you're talking about in the colonies at that time, you have a little over 2.5 million people. That's all 1% of the whole population dies as a result of the war. Which, you know, in today's population, you're talking like 3 million people dying. And you're also talking, you know, and the majority of these deaths, aren't battlefield deaths. Majority of them are from disease, and just how, you know, terrible these diseases were. And as, you know, and as you mentioned, you know, what we're experiencing now with COVID, and that's with all the science and technology we have, you can't imagine how terrifying it would be not knowing how these different diseases are being spread. You know, I wrote a whole blog post about the 1793 yellow fever pandemic in Philadelphia, and just, you know, the total lack of understanding of how that disease spread. I mean, they were wearing masks, lighting bonfires in the streets, you know, doing all these things, not realizing that it was the mosquitoes that were passing this disease around. And so, you know, just the fear that must have pervaded society at that time, you know, how they were able to deal with that kind of uncertainty. You know, it makes we should all be grateful we live in the time period we do, because it would have been terrifying not knowing, how often death would be coming around everybody's door. I mean, you mentioned, John mentioned Yorktown, the camp fevers. George Washington's own stepson catches camp fever and dies just a couple weeks after the surrender at Yorktown. I mean, this did not, it did not choose between class or skin color or anything else like that. A lot of people are getting sick, people are dying left and right. And it was a common thing that everybody had to deal with. And so it's, like I said, we should just be grateful we live in the time period we did, for sure.
That's a great point. I mean, we always talk about that other war that happens and how big the population was and the deaths and so forth. But that's, I think, one of the misconceptions of the American Revolution is how much death and dying and loss of life there was. I mean, 1% of the population is a astronomical figure at that time, and I think that gets written off because of later wars and so forth. But yeah, great point there, Mark. So we got about 5 minutes left. I'd like to conclude. Let's go around to the top of my screen from Michael all the way down. Vanessa, you're last. No offense, but we have other meetings to attend together, so that's why you're last. But any last points, myths, misconceptions, hindsights that weren't covered, Michael?
I mean, just because of the work that I do, I think people need to understand how much maneuvering these troops went through in between these battles. I think people see battles as set piece things and don't realize what goes on in between them and how it affects both armies. And I just know, working on my Germantown book, the amount of maneuvering Washington does between Brandywine and Germantown and the miles those guys put on in that basically 3-week period is insane. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's probably close to 60, 70 miles that they're putting on just marching, not mentioning the other skirmishes and minor engagements that takes place. I don't think people appreciate that aspect of soldier life when they, they can understand the conflict of battle and what people go through. But what about in between those battles? And how does it affect their fighting ability going into the next battle? I just think that's something that needs to be appreciated a little bit more.
All right. No, that's a great point. Thanks, Mike. John, passing on down.
I'll actually go back to African Americans or Americans of African descent. I mean, you had the number that actually fought for the Whig side, the cause of independence. But then you had all the Africans who didn't necessarily fight for the British, but they went over to the British side, and that wasn't done because the British were against slavery. That was done as a really pragmatic strike against the Americans, against the rebels. They did promise them their freedom, but when you look at how they were treated during the Yorktown campaign, especially when they caught smallpox, which largely was, and they were left by the wayside, or they were chased out of the British lines, basically to fend for themselves. They were basically pawns. They were pawns, of the British and the situation at the time. Again, some people hear about the Book of Negroes at the end of the war, and about all the Black Americans who went to Canada and gained their freedom. Some were sent to Liberia. Some went to the West Indies. A few were actually re-enslaved. But it wasn't because of this great largesse that this great idea of the British wanted freedom for Blacks. It was a pragmatic move. I mean, that the British actually stood by the African Americans or the Blacks at the end of the war says a lot for them, because Washington wanted them returned. That's why the Book of Negroes was made. Washington wanted to list a documentation of all the Blacks that had been basically, quote unquote, stolen from Americans, and he wanted them returned. But Carleton refused to do that. So that itself is a shining light. But their treatment post-war in Canada was not always good. Again, it's a really tough and not a, and I don't mean this as a pun, but not a black and white situation. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, John. Mark.
Yeah, now, I'll go back to, the campaign I mentioned, Trenton, Princeton, and, we just talked about how fragile everything was. I think nothing shows that more than that campaign. And although the myth is this painting of Washington crossing the Delaware confidently and going on to great victory in the founding of the country, at the time it was how close we came to actual defeat. I love this quote, from John Adams to his wife when he says, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it." I think that's a great quote to realize how grateful we should be, and that all of this, the country as we know it today, would not have been possible without the sacrifices and the efforts of these people 250 years ago. So I think it's important not to remember that it's not this myth. This was actually happened or whatever. So.
No, great quote. Yeah, thanks, Mark, for sharing. And Ms. Smiley.
You're making me follow that. Like, oh man, no pressure.
I mean, he is a fellow park ranger, so you can...
I know, I gotta one-up him, right? No, I think it kind of piggybacks a little bit on what Mark was saying, that there's a potentially that misconception of the fact that maybe this history doesn't matter, or that it's not relevant to today, but it is. And I think that's our biggest challenge going forward into the 250th is, obviously we're commemorating a lot of these events, but really finding those deeper connections and truly understanding why this history is important. Connecting with these stories that are both unknown and untold, and really just seeing how these stories are relevant to today's modern time. And I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but events like this and continued programming are what's going to help us get there. And so hopefully one day we can dispel the misconception that a 250-year-old history doesn't matter anymore, because it does.
So, well, thank you all, Mike, John, Mark, and Vanessa, for being part of the panel. Great questions and answering. Thank you for all those who put questions in the chat as well. So for the conclusion, I'll pass it over to Liz here to end our day.
Well, thanks again, all. This was really amazing, and we've got a lot of love in the chat for our full day of conversation. And I gotta say, it's my tavern heart is happy, because these are the types of things that would have happened in our public dining room, these conversations and these debates. And we kind of pick up at Gadsby's Tavern Museum, we pick up from all of these stories that we've heard over the course of today. And we pick up, we won, yay! What happens next? What do we do? What do we become? So I highly encourage you to come visit us in Alexandria, because we explore that story of what happens next. And it's just as complex and messy as the revolution and prior. So again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everyone at home. And as we always say at Gadsby's Tavern Museum, a huzzah to everyone.